Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Genesis Community Livecast. This is our Genesis Shapers recap episode for September 2020 Shapers meeting. For those that don't know me, I'm David Vogelpohl. Been a proud member of the Genesis community for over 8 years. I lead Genesis at WP Engine, and I love helping the Genesis community get better together with my friends from the Shapers. Joining us for this episode are two Shapers themselves. I'd like to welcome back to the Shaper Recap episode, Carrie Dils of CarrieDils.com. Hey, Carrie.
Howdy, howdy. Thanks for having me back.
So glad to have you back. You were there on our inaugural episode of the Shapers Recap videos, so I like that. And then also joining us is Nawaii Badiola.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to have you here. For those unfamiliar with Nawaii, he is a Genesis shaper. He runs a business called Codico Genesis, which specializes in training people on Genesis in the Spanish language. Did I get that right, Nawaii?
Yep, right on the spot.
Nice. And you're based out of Spain, but you help Spanish-speaking people in the Genesis community all around the world, right?
Indeed. Yeah, the Spanish one is really vibrant, but now the South America is also picking up and is also growing. So it's really nice to see that also. Yeah.
Yes. We saw Eduardo's contribution of translations of Genesis into the Mexican subvariant of Spanish recently. That was really nice. I was wondering before we get started, though, if you could just quickly tell us a little bit about the Genesis community, particularly around Codico in Spain and in the Spanish-speaking communities in general.
Okay, so Código Genesis at the end is like a small platform that, small, now it has more like 500 tutorials related with WordPress. And also Genesis-specific tutorials. And the idea is to share the knowledge there. And there is also like I would say a small or mid-sized community inside that they can ask. And I will probably prepare a tutorial for them also. And I think that the nicest point of the Genesis Spanish-speaking point was last year when we had the Genesis event that was Genesis BCN for Barcelona. That is the city that is we are around. And we were like, I don't know, around 60 people. It was really nice to gather all the people that was interested in WordPress and Genesis. And it's a pity that this year it's a bit more complicated because we were, after ending that one, we were already thinking in the next one because it was a really nice gathering of people. Really similar to WordPress WordCamps that I love to, or meetups that I love to go because the ambient is always very friendly, very very nice people talking about interesting things. So and I think that is the community in Spanish-speaking developers. I think is not as big as in US. But it's picking up, and it's growing, and there is a lot of people wanting to learn and to share knowledge. So it's nice.
Awesome. Well, thanks for doing that, Nawaii. I know that's been a big. I know we're going to get to this later with your Genesis origin story, but I know this is a big part of your life, and I know others helped you along the way. So it's so cool to see you also helping people learn. I saw the photos from the event. I was so jealous I couldn't go. Hopefully, when the pandemic dies down, we can get back to in person.
We were planning to invite you and other people to come if it was possible, but this was before the pandemic. So we will pick up after this dies and goes a bit.
I look forward to it. All right. Well, let's jump right into the meeting and talk about what was discussed. And we'll go question by question and talk a little bit about the discussion that took place. So the first question on the agenda was our call to order. Nawaii showed up, Robin Cornett, Matthew Cardenas from the product team within Genesis, Travis Smith, a Genesis shaper, Ryan Murray of 3200 Creative. Ryan's such a great guy. And let's see, we have a bunch of other raised hands. There's so many different ways people are saying they're there. Bill Erickson, John Paris from Genesis Blocks, Brian Smith from the product team, Matt Lawrence from the Genesis engineering team, Mike Hemberger from BizBudding. And we also have Anita Carter, I know Sally, WP Fangirl, came in a little bit later, so it was a good crowd. And then Carrie Dils, yes, Carrie was there. Carrie, where's your hand? I don't see your hand like in my face here.
My hand might have still been sleeping.
Oh, did you show up late to the meeting?
Yeah, I was a little late to the party, recovering from the holiday.
Oh, that's funny. That's one good thing about a Zoom meeting, though, is you can kind of like show up late and people don't really notice as much unless they're called out when someone does like a video
Yes.
podcast like this. Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Nick Croft also there. Nick the Geek, author of the book Genesis Explained. He's also there. That was fun. All right. So our first real question, though, is what is your Genesis origin story? Least words wins. If you've been following the Shapers since the very beginning, a little over 2 years now, I guess, that we actually asked this question of all the Shapers in that very first meeting. Carrie, you were there, right? But Nawaii, you weren't. You weren't a Shaper yet. You became a Shaper after you, myself, David Decker, and Remkus de Vries, right? I met there at WordCamp Europe in Berlin at the Genesis Community
Fun
Party.
times, yeah.
Yes, that was one of my favorite WordCamp moments, actually. One of my favorite photos was actually of the four of us, and that was a lot of fun. But we've had Shapers join since we initially founded it who never actually answered this question, so it was fun to kind of revisit this. Carrie, Bill was the first one to give a real answer. What did he say?
He was a thesis versus GPL.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Traveling in our Wayback Machine there to the great GPL controversy that a lot of folks found Genesis with. I shared my origin story, and again, least words wins. So Bill has 3 words now, although he acronymed GPL. So I feel like that should count as 5 words. But mine are Pat, Ramsey, made me. So I have 4 versus Bill's 3.
Well, you
Carrie,
used an emoji in there. Does that count as a word?
No, the emoji was the celebration of the 4 words.
Okay.
It didn't count as a word.
Excellent.
But you know Pat, right?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yes.
Pat made me get into accessibility. So Pat Ramsey makes people do things.
That's cool. Nawaii, have you had the opportunity to meet Pat Ramsey?
Not yet.
Okay, he's with a company called Crowd Favorite. They're a very successful WordPress agency. And Pat actually worked for me in my agency many years ago. And we were trying to choose a framework for the agency to settle on. We were kind of battling between 2. And then Pat told me, he said, just choose Genesis, David. And we chose Genesis. So that was my origin story back in the day. Are you seeing Nick's comment here? Nawaii, what's he saying here? It's like he got started shortly after it was publicly released.
Did it a lot wrong, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wrote a book about all the things I did wrong. I loved Nick's answer. It's really, it's a really cool way to put it right. The things that you already did wrong, you just write a book, easy to do, to avoid to other people to do the same.
Yeah, I like it.
errors.
Like you didn't have a book to help you, so you wrote a book to explain all that. That's what it's called, Genesis Explained, I'm guessing.
I guess
I know
too.
he's kept that up to date over time. Anita Carter, who was actually on the episode 1 of the Genesis Livecast reboot with Mike Little and Sandy Jackson talking about the contributions of the Black community to WordPress and Genesis, but also some of those challenges. She told her origin story actually on that live cast. She retells it here. She has quite a few words. I don't think she's going to win the least word competition, but it's Revolution 2 themes before Genesis. And then when, I don't know what RT means, but a Revolution theme switched to Studio Press. So basically version 0 of Genesis, as I like to call it, was Revolution theme. And Revolution theme was one of the very first themes that really showcased a widgetized homepage. And I like to think of this moment as when people said, oh, wow, look, you can build a website with WordPress. Of course, people were doing that before, but with those widgetized home pages, that's really when we started, I felt, to diverge between themes, websites, if you would, versus blogs. Do you Carrie, do you think of that moment as that, or do you think of it as something different?
That's interesting. That was before I had even started working with WordPress. And yeah.
So you're looking at it in the rear view mirror, even though we've gone past it. Nawaii, what about you? Are you as way back as Revolution theme?
Not that way back. No, not really. I started using WordPress at 2014, and Genesis pretty much in the same year. So yeah, I guess that is.
I was going to say, your response here, though, says you went from WordPress implementer to a developer in great part thanks to Genesis. So were you building, like, you say implementer, help me understand what you meant by that.
Yeah. I didn't know if in English is as well known as in Spanish. Implementer means more like how to build sites, but not that much of the technical part. So maybe you are not fighting or doing so much stuff in the PHP and this kind of thing. So building from zero, you are using more like themes and modifying, using premium plugins, know how they work, but not going deep into the guts of the of the architecture. And the really nice thing about Genesis, and I always explain it that way, is that if you are willing to learn more about PHP and all the hierarchy and everything, Genesis is a good start point, because you will start probably copy and pasting snippets from great sites like Carrie or Dils or others. But slowly, if you are interested, you will pick up what are you doing, which hook are you using, which function are you using. So for me, this is the nicest thing of Genesis, because I knew that I wanted to go a bit farther than just build sites. I wanted to tinker a little bit more. So I think that Genesis got that part really, really, really great.
Good. Yeah, we often will say the word implementer to discuss someone who's building a WordPress site, but not necessarily, modifying the code or creating their own code. I've also heard this called as like WordPress builders and stuff like that. But I also will often talk about it in the lens of like a non-technical website builder. But really it's this notion of, are you modifying or creating code? And I know a lot of people, I've heard this origin story about people being a developer, because of WordPress and because of things like Genesis that kind of help them bridge those gaps between, I need to make a website, or I want to make a website, and then maybe I want to get good at making websites.
Right.
So that was interesting to hear. Carrie, I don't see your origin story in here. I feel like you didn't answer this question. What is your Genesis origin story?
Well, you might not want me to answer because it's going to beat your 4 words.
Oh, well, I think what's his name? Bill's in the lead with 3, even though he acted.
Oh, that's true. Well, in that case, I'll beat Bill, because my Genesis origin is Bill Erickson.
I like it. So
nice.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit, because I know both of you, actually, a lot of other people's origin stories with Genesis actually started with the 2 of you, but you started with Bill. What was the thing that Bill did that got you started with Genesis, Carrie?
That's a great question. I've looked at his website and saw that he is basically building an agency, a one-man agency delivering websites and using the Genesis framework. And once I start kind of digging into his tutorials, and I love his code snippet library, and just really admired what he was doing. So tried to follow.
Yeah, he built a very admirable, I hate to even say the word, but like freelance business, if you will. He's kind of got a little squad that all work together and do crazy things, but he's had a really admirable way of going about that for a long time. And he's local to, for me here in Austin. I know you're now in LA, but you were in Texas, I guess, around that time. I'm guessing you probably ran into Bill here and there.
Yeah. He had us over... gosh, I don't know if it was a Genesis meetup or...
Oh, yeah, in Georgetown, probably.
Yeah, over at his house. He and his wife hosted us.
Yeah, he's such a great guy. Robin Cornett said she helped the nonprofit move away from a custom and expensive solution. Great origin story, but not a winner in the least words competition. So far, that would be Carrie Dils. Let's see, Sally. Sally, known as @WP Fangirl, she worked with a friend from her meetup on a Genesis site for a local branch of the United Way. That was back when, I mentioned this earlier, widgetized homepages were revolutionary. And before RWD was a thing? Why am I not knowing what RWD is?
Responsive web design.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. All right, so that would have been a decent amount back. So that was her origin story. Travis Smith went to WordCamp Raleigh in 2011, 2012. So this would have just been a couple of years after Genesis was created, or at least officially branded, and he met Nathan Rice, Nathan Rice at that time was the lead developer of Genesis. Nathan is actually in engineering management now and has a team working on Genesis. But he offered Genesis as an alternative to Thesis, and then he offered to help him learn WordPress and Genesis. And then in parenthetical, Travis says, though I bet he regretted it. So I don't think he regretted it. Travis is a great guy, and love having his input here. All right, so the next question we had, this one was a nice and easy one. Would you like to join us as a guest for a future Shapers recap video? Add a Genesis logo emoji. It looks like Nawaii, you were one of the ones that put your logo up there. It looks like we also have Sally. We'll have her on the future, and Nick Croft. And then I feel like the other Shapers were shy because I feel like I see them all the time in all the places. So I'm gonna revisit this one, and we put a little peer pressure, get them on for some future videos. All right, so the next question up, the way we think about questions for Shapers meetings is we kind of group them. We group them into feedback on the products, feedback on the community, things that might be fun or interesting. And then, if we really want to get specific on like product oriented questions, we'll do that too. And so the next question was actually around the community. And the reason we asked this question was really to kind of help inform us as we think about exposing people to the Genesis community as they use Genesis and the various products, and just engage with us in general. And so the question is, how do you describe the spirit and or nature of the Genesis community when you mention it to others? Nawaii, you were the very first response. Tell me what you said here.
Yeah, I say that it's, for me, it's like an extension of WordPress, of the awesome WordPress community, meaning in the good sense that it's really easy to go to this kind of meetings, or even if it's online in the Slack or whatever blog, you can go to Carrie's blog and ask a question. And there is always this sense of people trying to help you. So, and they see you more like a colleague, more than a competition. So this, I think you use the the word kumbaya thing around WordPress and Genesis. I think that it's in a good way. I think that is one of the coolest thing of Genesis, apart from the great technical part. But yeah, I think that is.
Yeah, it's funny, as I describe the WordPress community and then the Genesis sub-community, if you will, the descriptions are almost interchangeable. Yeah. And in WordPress, we have all these sub-communities. I think the WooCommerce community is also in that same vein, what we might consider to be, core aligned, or kind of WordPress community aligned. Of course, there are other sub-communities with different WordPress tools, which sometimes are, sometimes aren't kind of in that spirit of the overall WordPress community, depending on what the sub-community is. But I thought that was a good way to think about it. And then the next comment was actually from me, and after some conversations with Brian Gardner, right around the time of the acquisition of StudioPress by WP Engine. He really described it as, the Genesis community gets better together. That notion of, I guess WP Fangirl has an origin story here somewhere. Did she remove it? I don't know where it is now. Oh my goodness. But where people kind of helped you, learn how to build websites at all. And I think that's having come from other technical communities where it's all about being the smartest and not admitting any weakness in how you're learning and where you are in your process, getting shamed out of forums because you're not technical enough. I feel like, it's like this process of like helping others along And then when you're along, helping those behind you also make that same kind of progress. I'm guessing, how do you think about that, Carrie?
I totally agree. I think back to my very early days with WordPress and interacting with women like Andrea Rennick and Kim Parcell um, and people who had zero obligation to help me, but would readily and happily answer my questions. And it just sort of modeled right out the gate that uh, help other people along without any expectation of getting something in return, and made me want to then go back and do the same for those behind me.
Yeah, you never know where those seeds you leave behind will grow into something good. So I think that's a big part of it for me as well. Madison Sadler. Madison is on the Genesis product and engineering team. So again, the product and engineering folks join the Shapers meeting so they can hear the feedback. But his origin story was, I sat next to Matt Lawrence. So Matt is an engineering manager that came to WP Engine through the StudioPress acquisition. And we're in WP Engine orientation as a new hire, and he inspired me to learn the product. So that's something we do at WP Engine actually for our new employees, is really show them Genesis, get them connected with themes. If there's in the engineering group, of course, that goes much further, and depending on what part of engineering, but everybody has that opportunity to kind of learn a little bit and experience some of the products themselves. It varies, of course. Our accountants are less averse than our support people and so on and so forth. But it's definitely part of our onboarding. Bill Erickson says, I guess Madison was sharing his origin story, I guess, after the question was asked, second question was asked. But then Bill describes the community as collaborative, open, and sharing. I think there was a lot of sentiment and agreement around that. Mm-hmm. I liked Sally, how she pointed out people here are colleagues, even though we could technically be described as competitors. And I think it's funny because both of you actually train people in Genesis and your various business interests. And I don't know if you've ever really thought that much about it. Again, this notion of like agencies working together, course providers, people providing different technologies. I think it's really encouraging and something I don't see in other places. I see, people arguing and trying to, again, to be the smartest one in the forum or the smartest one in Slack, and not really be working in a collaborative way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, as Robin Cornett kind of summed it up nicely, that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that idea of
yep, nice sentence.
Yeah. I can't really even add to it. It's good as is.
All right. Well, I love the rising tides here. And then really, I'm not going to read, every single one of these, but I think, it's really that thematic part of, someone helped you, so now I'm going to help them. And to, better together is how Gardner had put it. And so that's good to hear that feedback and to get that validated as we think about sharing it for others. So if you're listening or watching and you're thinking about how am I going to describe the Genesis community to other people, just think about that notion of better together. That really, to me, sums it all up. All right. Next question is a product question. What long-time bugs, fixes, or improvements do you wish were addressed in the Genesis framework? Anita was the first one to comment. She says, I think there is a bug with comments. Some site owners need to uncheck the box to display comments and save, then check the box again for comments to display. This spawned a thread. Basically, that was a reminder of a previous issue some folks were experiencing with comments. It's actually already been flagged. Nick Chernis, I believe, on the Genesis engineering team has a ticket around this. So that was one thing that Anita had reported. Ryan Murray of 3200 Creative says, great optimization out of the box is long overdue. He didn't actually expand on what he meant by that. So I guess we'll have to get back to Ryan on that one. This one was interesting from Robin Cornett. It could be just me, but I removed the entry meta from every post type except posts on every site. Nawaii, I see you shaking your head. Do you have any thoughts on Robin's comment here?
Yeah, I think it was a good point, but I don't know if we are too different between the developers. I don't do that necessarily always. And I think now it's quite easy to do because you can do it. Of course, you can do almost anything with a snippet, but now you can also do it as a user, plain user, from the customizer. It's pretty easy to remove or add the shortcode. So I wouldn't say that is a big thing for me, but I understand that depending on your workflows, maybe it would help you if it's by default turned off in the custom post types.
Yeah, optionality, of course, is something that the engineering and product folks look at really closely. Like when is there an opinion something is done automatically or quote, can't be changed? And when is there optionality? And it sounds like for Robin, this is important, but not necessarily for you. And so I think this is good illustration between the notion of default and opinions versus optionality. And of course, that's a balancing act because sometimes it's good to have an opinion, but not if you're going to do that necessarily in a way that's going to, alienate a lot of legitimate use cases and developers. So then, Nawaii, you say having a starter theme is discussed in previous meetings, but I guess now it's better to wait until FSC is well defined. So your suggestion was having a starter theme, and I know in the subthread, I was asking you about sample. Do you consider Genesis sample a starter theme, or are you thinking specifically for full site editing?
Yeah, it is. I base most of my works on Genesis sample. I think that is a great starter, but I think that you could add some tools to generate like a more specific starter theme, like similar to what is done with underscores, or that you can just put like, I don't know, maybe prefixes, the names, and some things. For me, it's not that important, the sassification, because I don't use it, but I understand that maybe one check to create the SAS version also could be nice. But I was in that direction. Something Nick Ternis displayed us or showed us in a previous meeting, like a mock-up of the hypothetical or possible starter theme, and I think it was just in that direction. So I would say the architecture would be Genesis sample, but maybe having a few steps before generating the theme to customize just a bit the starter theme. That would be the idea I was behind. And I know gotcha. Some people would be interested. That's why I usually say it in the Genesis Shapers meeting, because I have had another colleagues that they really would like to have something like that.
Understood.
So people working with Genesis, and also people that is not working yet with Genesis, but they would love to have this underscore method to generate a Genesis starter theme. Yeah.
Okay, good suggestion. I know you had also mentioned the context of full site editing. I know we've talked about that quite a bit here in the Genesis blog and in prior videos. For those unfamiliar, full site editing is referring to when the Gutenberg block editor will be extended to the header, the sidebar, and the footer of a website, turning the block editor from a page builder into a site builder. When that occurs, themes will drastically change. The file structure of themes will change. The PHP functions you can use within a theme will be restricted where they are today. And so what a full site editing theme looks like will look a lot different than it is today. And so I feel like, Nawaii, your point here is, these are helpful things for a lot of developers, but obviously, kind of where do you spend that time and energy in order to deliver that value over time? And the point about FSC is, as the new way of building themes comes out, is that where you kind of narrow in on your starter theme, efforts, if you would. And I think the answer for us, Nawaii, is probably a little bit of both, because, the way themes are built today, non-full site editing themes, is the way everyone else in WordPress builds themes. So you're not alone. There's nothing to run out and try. You don't have to freak out right now. Full site editing will be released in December 2018 as a public beta in WordPress core. So you can try it out. It's beta mode in December 2018. Our objective with Genesis is to have our products ready for full site editing when it is in public beta. So you can leverage Genesis blocks, Genesis custom blocks, as well as FSE, full site editing specific themes. And so these will be different than the themes we use today. And the Genesis framework, of course, is used to build themes in the way we build themes today. Now, on December 31st, 2020, I think I said 18 earlier, that's when it was initially released for Gutenberg. But in December 2020, will the old themes break? Nawaii or Carrie?
Nope.
No, they won't break. Should you stop building themes the way you build them today on January 1st, 2021?
Nope.
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 FSC isn't even out of beta. Will your themes break? And I know you can't guarantee the future, but will your themes break a year after FSC is released in WordPress core?
They shouldn't.
Yes. This is the hemming and hawing that comes from predicting the future. But WordPress has an excellent tradition for backwards compatibility. Every single WordPress website on earth today has themes in the old way. Everyone that will be released tomorrow has them in the old way, all the way up until full site editing is released. So don't feel anxious that you're not doing something you should be doing right now, or that your site's going to break when full site editing is released. But at the same time, and I kind of get back to the question, Nawaii, is like, where do we spend the energy? Well, it's kind of both, because the way of building websites today will still be used for a long time after FSC is released. But of course, at the same time, we want to make sure that the Genesis community and everyone else in WordPress is prepared with themes and plugins and other things that help them win with full site editing. So that was a long answer to that question, but I think your point was well taken, which is that these a better starter theme with specific optimizations around the build is helpful, but it's, again, getting back to that question of where do you spend your energy. There was a lot of discussions around build processes. Nick Croft brought this up quite a bit. Sally, WP Fangirl, I have to figure out build processes first before she worries about them. Carrie, I don't know if you could give us a quick walkthrough of build processes just for people unfamiliar with that. And I know you don't know exactly what Nick is talking about, and that can mean a few different things, but if you could give people the gist, that would be helpful.
Sure. I'm guessing that he means automations in the development flow. So being able to set up task runners and do things like compile your CSS partials or what's the word? Compress.
Minification. Minify.
Yes. To minify.
Smaller.
Things like that if you're using a starter theme and it's the basis of every project, then there are, some build tools you can add in there that just sort of optimize your workflow. That's my guess of what he's talking about.
This was kind of maybe less clear for me, but it was like, and I did ask this question. So is it documentation and training that Nick thinks people using Genesis should use, or are actually modifying the products themselves? Carrie, I know you had some thoughts on that. I don't know if you have thought more about it or have anything to share here.
I think Nick was, oh man, I can't read anybody's mind. Can't even.
Well, he says, make the sample child theme, use a build process, and document how to use it. So his notion was not every theme. And of course, a lot of the people using the premium child themes are not going to ever use a build process. So his notion was, essentially to do that with sample and then document how it's used. And he has some other specific recommendations around minification and so on and so forth. But I think it's interesting, internally at WP Engine, people will often say, well, what is Genesis about? Is it about DIY developers or is it about advanced developers? And, it's funny because the answer is both. If you're a user of a premium child theme, you might not be very technical at all. But if you're leveraging Genesis, the framework to build custom themes from scratch, in a sense, or even using sample and then modding from there, you can get very, very technical. Nick the Geek, certainly Carrie, you and Nawaii. And so there's this broad spectrum of people that use the products, and you're like, well, wait a minute, but who is the product for? And it's funny, the way that I rationalize all this is that the Genesis framework and things like Genesis custom blocks and other kind of developer-centric tools, if you will, are really to allow developers to build experiences that content creators love to use. So you as a freelancer, or if you were an agency and or if you were internal at a brand, you're building a beautiful design, but you're building it in the context of a CMS. So that way, either you yourself or non-technical content creators can go behind you and create new experiences without every new experience being a design and development ticket. I think blocks really extends the power of that. But as I think about things like the blocks within Genesis custom blocks or all the premium child themes, those are expressions of how the Genesis development tools can be used to build things that are easy. And so that's how I personally think about the dichotomy in the community, is like you have, super hyper nerds over here and less technical people on the other side, but it's really kind of two sides of the same coin. How do you think about that analogy, Carrie? Or actually, Nawaii, I haven't asked you a question.
No, I think it's great that you are focusing in both profiles. Especially because I'm a developer. I really like to work with Genesis because it speeds up my workflows and it has a quite clean code at the end and it's easy to tinker with. But I always think about the final user. So I love that you implemented the one-click setup for the premium themes, because it was really one of the biggest pain points of a user that is trying to get the look of the demo that he's looking at, and he's getting something really, really different. So this part, I think that it was very well done for your part. And together with Gutenberg, that indeed they came together, they can really do like the basic thing. If you don't have enough money for pay a developer, and you take a nice premium child theme, and with the one-click setup, you will probably could do something. If you don't mess a lot with the styles, you will probably end up with a pretty nice website that then you can tinker on or change the blocks. So I think that part is also interesting, and I think that is a good approach that you also go in that way. And in this, related with this, is really nice for theme creators because you are putting some tools for them to have a better end product. So I think that is good. That
it was interesting because to me it wasn't about separating the two. They were directly connected. The experience of the content creator and the experience of the developer. And I remember when Gutenberg came out, people were like, "Oh, you're just turning WordPress into Wix." And I'm like, well, not really. WordPress is open and extensible. Jason Cohen, our CTO and founder, actually has a really interesting analogy where he says, look, dolphins and sharks both have fins, but they're fundamentally different animals. They both have fins because fins are helpful for the environment in which you exist as an ocean-dwelling animal. And so CMS, content management systems, benefit from things like block-based building approaches. And so as I think of Genesis's role in that, again, if I'm a DIY person, I can use Genesis blocks. I can use things like a one-click setup theme and all that other kind of stuff to like go super fast. But if I'm a brand or an agency, I can create my own versions of that. One-click theme setup isn't something you can only use when you buy a theme. As a developer, you can make your own one-click theme setup. And maybe it's for selling your themes, but maybe it's also for setting up your marketing team to create the next microsite for their event faster or whatever the thing is. So, it's really interesting to think of the product suite as not just for one thing, that's actually for both, but that's actually really helpful because the developers are trying to create those experiences. Next question in the agenda was we released Genesis blocks on WordPress.org. I think it was the week before we had the meeting. And we said, what are your observations and advice regarding the .org version of Genesis blocks now that it's live? Nawaii, you brought up the WP Tavern article. And for those that didn't see it on WP Tavern, there was a write-up. I forget the author's name offhand, but basically there was someone in the...
I think it was Justin Tatlock. I think
Yep, it was. Yep, I remember that now. So in Justin's article, he had talked to someone who had problems converting from atomic blocks to Genesis blocks. Now, for those following along, there actually will be migration tech to make that super easy, but this person had kind of gone about it on his own. And it was funny because in the Genesis blocks update, Mike McAllister had removed the prefixes to the block. So it'd say like, GB dash block name and AB and for atomic blocks dash block name. And it was funny because Mike later commented, he was like, look, I did that to not like shove Genesis and atomic blocks branding all in the block interface and everything like that. But there was this kind of usability side effect where the person mentioned in the article couldn't differentiate between what blocks were what and had to go through his whole site. What do you think about that, Nawaii, since you were the one to bring that topic up here?
Yeah, I think that Mike's intentions were really good.
And there's no standard about this, right? Like this is just like...
that's the point. That's the point, that there is a missing standard, and that's why these kind of things are happening. So yeah, probably it makes sense to have a standard for every third-party plugins, and especially block collections, to have a way to just add the prefix or something that the user can distinguish between the native blocks and the others. So yeah, in this case, I think it was just because there is still no standard. I hope that this event or this happening and Justin writing about it brings the attention, and now they can develop or write about a standard that Genesis blocks and all the third-party blocks can use and follow. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we can be out here on this leading edge, finding all the problems. I mean, this is this is always fun, right? Obviously, as things are released, and as Nawaii mentioned, there are no standards around block naming, and situations like this actually help evolve standards. So. Glad for Justin to have shared that person's story and the opportunity to learn there. And it sounds like hopefully the overall WordPress also looking to learn there as well. It's one of our favorite parts of contributing in WordPress and participating in WordPress is, helping to define what that means or what comes next and so on and so forth. Looks like Robin Cornett, she runs a local meetup. She said she showed it in her local meetup last week. And the sections and layouts were very impressive. Nawaii, you talked a little bit about one-click theme setup and how it kind of gets you to this faster part forward. Of course, that's kind of the sentiment or experience that we're shooting for in Genesis blocks, sections, and layouts. The way I reference it to friends, family, and colleagues is when I want to show someone the magic of WordPress, I show them things like one-click theme setup, sections, and layouts. We have collections coming soon, so this will be a whole other thing, which we'll actually be talking about in future videos. But that'll be the next kind of evolution, if you will, of sections and layouts. Looks like Nick is happy that his custom CSS appears to still be working after the release of Genesis blocks. So yay for that. I think that's another thing with Genesis blocks. It's not just the pre-configured and pre-designed blocks that come with it, but you still, of course, have the ability to customize the look and feel of those blocks. So it looks like Nick's custom CSS was working, so that made him happy. Let's see here. What else? Looks like Sally tested it. Looks like the name change confused her a bit. We've seen, different, as we've, released Genesis blocks, Genesis custom blocks, and then just getting ready for full site editing. Just the one thing to reiterate is we're elevating the name Genesis. So up to date, Genesis has primarily been used to refer to the Genesis framework. As we had things like atomic blocks, which came over as part of another acquisition shortly after StudioPress, as we brought on the team from Block Lab to build Genesis custom blocks, we knew we needed names for things. And of course, as I'm sure you've experienced in the middle of doing all this, sometimes the naming is confusing. But when you start saying things like, if you want to build with StudioPress, build with Genesis Framework, StudioPress themes, Atomic Blocks, Block Lab, and 5 other things that don't have this kind of common naming convention, it really becomes even more difficult. And I know these in-between steps are confusing and weird, and it's hard to make sense of it, but really that was the reason why we renamed essentially Atomic Blocks to Genesis Blocks. So as Chris Garrett, longtime StudioPress person, put it, again, we're elevating that brand Genesis because it means so much. I mean, obviously the community is defined in that way, so on and so forth. And so that's why the renaming was really focused there. Let's see. Sally was in favor of reviewing the blocks in Genesis blocks to see if they are redundant now, or if there are core blocks that maybe are, might be similar, where the blocks in Genesis blocks wouldn't be needed anymore. That's something we definitely always look at. Let's see what else here. Looks like Sally had some nice suggestions around transforming blocks. It looks like this is something that some other block technology has taken advantage of. Looks like she's talking about that in the context of the migration technology, which will be out soon. Let's see what else. Okay, so that was for the most part it on Genesis blocks. I mean, people, in general thought it worked. Sally had specific points around, do we need this block or that block? And then some questions around the naming, and then of course the prefix issue, which we talked about earlier. So the next question to the shapers is, what are your observations or advice regarding the .org version of Genesis custom blocks now that it is live? Speaking of naming confusion, Sally, WP Fangirl, this meeting's taking place at 7 a.m. her time on the West Coast. And it says, isn't that what we just talked about? And she replies again, yes, it is. You have it in the agenda twice. And then she replies, oops, never mind, not enough coffee yet. That's right. Genesis blocks and Genesis custom blocks are different plugins. And I think this is also interesting as we think about the naming convention here, because, Sally just didn't notice the word custom in between Genesis and blocks. But yes, rest assured, it was a different plugin. Nick wondered if that confusion is a confusion other users will feel. Having used Genesis blocks and Genesis custom blocks nomenclature internally and externally, the difference between those two actually I haven't seen a ton of confusion around that. I know there's been confusion around Genesis Pro and Pro Plus and all these other things. But I felt like I haven't actually run into a lot of problems with people differentiating between Genesis blocks and custom blocks. Carrie, what about you? I know you've kind of lived in both worlds here for a little while.
Yeah, I actually just put up a post this past week kind of differentiating the two. When I posted a question in the Genesis Facebook group about Genesis custom blocks, and some of the responses I got, I think you're talking about Genesis blocks.
Oh, okay, okay.
That's what led me to kind of realize that some people don't quite get the distinction that blocks is Genesis blocks is a collection or a library of existing blocks, whereas Genesis custom blocks lets you create brand new blocks from scratch.
Yeah, there were a few decisions around keeping that functionality separate. So why are they two plugins? Actually, might be one question people might have. I think they actually are serving two different roles, if you will. So that's one reason. And developers, of course, often will want kind of separation of concerns. Now, the plugins are orchestrated to work well together, of course. So that was fundamentally how the team landed on keeping them as two separate plugins. But yeah, they're very close in name, and of course, hindsight's always 20/20. But I'd say for myself, I'm comfortable with both names. I think they help. Fundamentally, the naming decision was around that the name should explain what the thing does. So we didn't want to make Genesis blocks lightning or something like that. Although maybe that would be more clear, because then you'd have like thunder and lightning or something like that, and then it'd be like, oh, that's obviously different. So that's fundamentally what drove those decisions, was really having the name be descriptive of what it does. And then, of course, to utilize or to use, if you will, the Genesis brand. And so we'll keep an eye on things.
In this point, I think it's pretty clear if you arrive to this point. I think that the messy part is the transition, because it's difficult to understand that Genesis Blocks was before Atomic Blocks, and now Block Lab is Genesis Custom Blocks, which makes sense to have two plugins, and they are different and everything. But I think that the hard part for you as a brand is communicating, and that's why write-ups like Carrie's, and I also did one in Spanish. And today we recorded in Freelander, the podcast. We did just a monographic about now that the change of name is already done, you have the two free versions of Genesis Blocks and Genesis Custom Blocks in the repo. And then inside Genesis Pro subscription, you have the Pro version of those two plugins. So now for me, it's pretty clear, but till we arrive till here, there was some confusion.
Yeah, I remember, man, I must have been a little over a year and a half ago now, when full site editing was kind of becoming more clear on the time frame and what it was going to look like. And I remember internally people asking, like, well, what's our plan for FSE? What are we going to do? You know, how does Genesis look in the future? And we put this kind of very loose talk track and deck together to kind of explain things with atomic blocks and custom blocks and things like that. But we had all these brand names and I was like, I can't explain this to myself. So how am I going to explain this to others? So that's when we kind of forged that naming convention and the general strategy we're executing against now. But as you pointed out, of course, the messy middle is where things are confusing. So thank you for your patience, and thanks certainly everyone listening for their patience as well. Let's see. Looks like Robin Cornett, she activated custom blocks briefly to prepare for the meetup talk or the meeting talk, but didn't have time to code output, so she didn't have any feedback. Carrie, I know you have a demo video of using custom blocks, so people can definitely check that out at studiopress.com/genesis-custom-blocks. Looks like Sally liked the name Block Lab, and that plugin's actually being deprecated. Of course, we went with custom blocks. Looks like Bill's thoughts. He played with it a bit today. He felt some of the advanced field options in the Pro version was what he would really need to embrace it. So he wasn't, necessarily going to embrace the free version right away, but he said he liked how it aligns with his block as a template partial approach he uses with another product for using custom blocks. Let's see, Carrie, you respond to this.
Yeah, my thought there, so if you look at the current documentation, the recommendation for coding out those partial templates is to put it in your theme. But as I've been playing with it and swapping out themes, I'm realizing I'm having to drag that blocks, all those template parts over to each theme, whereas if I just had it in a core functionality plugin or whatnot. So my recommendation was just to maybe change the documentation to build those blocks out as part of a plugin, so that it transcends whichever theme you've got activated.
You are alluding to full site editing at this point in a lot of ways, in this notion of, well, where do the templates reside and what wins, the theme versus the plugin? As a matter of fact, your recommendation is the plugin, the blocks should win versus having that within the theme. And of course, that's the way FSE in general is going. And we actually have a beta theme we're working on now, which is designed to illustrate the difference and how you might approach that, including those living in the on the plugin side versus the theme side. So these, of course, are very early times relative to FSE. Still a lot to answer there, but we actually will be releasing some content around that in the not too distant future, with a call for people to participate in a beta and help us understand what it's like to build a site in that way. You could think about this as our pre-FSE FSE beta. So it's not quite FSE, but it'll be the approach of the beta will really be centered around this notion of really where you're not doing a lot of that styling within the themes. So this is FSE, and this is what will come to WordPress, of course. And so we're trying to help keep the Genesis community and the rest of WordPress ahead of all that. Let's see what else here on this question that looks a lot different. So Nick thinks it's cool, Genesis custom blocks. He can see it being helpful to a lot of devs. He says, oh, this was interesting. I'm leaning hard into block patterns, and I can see how this is very similar. I feel 90% of the custom blocks I've had to build in the past were solved with a block pattern that I can do in minutes. So this was interesting. So he takes core blocks and uses them to assemble a block pattern, and then essentially that's how he creates a custom block without actually knowing JavaScript. Have you done that before, Carrie or Nawaii?
I have not.
Nawaii, have you?
Kind of, not relying that hardly on it, but yes, I didn't find. Now I usually, when I build websites, I don't use ACF plus all the design. I try to use always blocks, and usually with the core blocks and atomic blocks, now known as Genesis blocks. Indeed, I'm telling every people that is building a new site to use Genesis blocks from the start, because they will avoid the migration, which is cool. So at the end, using native blocks and the atomic blocks with the styling, I was able to manage pretty much every case in my scenario. So, but yeah, I think that the block patterns, before I use like reusable blocks to that aim, but now I think that block patterns is going to be one of the key features for the building of new themes.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I have that on my list of things to try. Nick's approach here before my WordCamp Philly talk at the end of September. So gonna hopefully be able to try that out and mention it, or maybe even show some examples in that talk. Next two questions on the agenda here. Where do you think Genesis custom blocks is helpful to less advanced developers? Why or why not? We asked them at the same time because we were kind of running low on time for the agenda. And then is HTML, CSS something a non-technical Genesis user could do? And this really started a lot of conversations around, well, what do you mean by a non-technical Genesis user? So what we don't mean is someone that doesn't know how to build with WordPress. What we mean is basically what Nawaii said at the beginning of this video, which was, I can build with a theme and some plugins, but I'm really not modifying code. I'm definitely not creating code. And so I guess I'm kind of answering the question there. But it was interesting because, it looks like looking at the responses, Nick himself then later comes in and says, Nick Croft, I think Genesis custom blocks is definitely helpful for less advanced developers because many aren't excited to learn JavaScript, React, and so a UI-driven system will be a big improvement for them. So in other words, you don't have to know React to build custom blocks, but you do have to know HTML, CSS, and a little PHP in order to build them. And so if you are truly non-technical, you're taking a one-click theme setup theme and modifying it in the block editor, you're probably going to have a high learning curve to use Genesis custom blocks. But if you're what I call the kind of run-of-the-mill WordPress developer skill set, you could mod HTML, CSS, and a little bit of PHP. And I know people get much more advanced than that, of course. But if you have that skill set, then Genesis custom blocks is likely something that you can pick up very quickly. Carrie, I know you've done a lot of demo content around GCB. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes. And Sally makes a good point that HTML and CSS are legit languages too, so don't brush them off as just being easy. But like you said, if for people that are already familiar with those, then yes, building out those custom block templates is pretty straightforward.
I like it. I like the call out to not dismiss them because they are true and difficult languages in many respects. What about you, Nawai?
Yeah, when I tried before Block Lab, and the building process is very similar. Maybe what I missed, or the part that I thought that it was harder for a non-technical user, is that when you don't have the template created, so you can build all the fields inside the block, but if you don't create the template that is going to display and render all the content, if you are still editing and you try to pre-visualize, sorry for the, try to see, in the front is giving you an error that is not really telling you a template is missing. It's like a generic Gutenberg error, and that part could be a bit of friction for a new user that didn't read the documentation, because the documentation is very well written and you can understand it, but some people don't doesn't read the documentation. So maybe changing that message, I don't know if it's possible, could help to point it in the right direction to the very newies.
Yeah, I think I flagged like 3 of the Genesis custom blocks folks from the R&D side in that thread, if I remember correctly. Rob Stenson, who's doing a lot of the documentation work. He's on the product marketing team. Luke Carbis, who's a product manager for Genesis Custom Blocks. And then Ryan Kenstra, I think is how you say his last name, an engineer on the GCB project. And so that's good feedback. I know error messages that aren't very clear are like the bane of everyone's existence, because you're like, what do I do? How do I deal with this? So that's good feedback. Thank you for helping us with that early on. All right, so the very last question, Genesis Shaper, September 2020. If you were wanting to start using Genesis custom blocks for the first time, what would be the most useful getting started resource for you? I.e., do you want, or what would you need to get moving quickly? I'm not going to read all the responses, but I would say that it was kind of like this tug and pull between I hate videos and I love videos and I just want documentation, or no, I need a step-by-step guide. And it was like, it's almost, I feel, representative of just like in general how people like to learn, is that some people love one way and some people love another way. I know that both of you actually specialize in training, so maybe Carrie, I'll start with you first. How do you think about the tug and pull of things like video content, step-by-step guides, super technical documentation, like all of it, some of it, or like cater it to your community?
Well, there is the element of catering it to your community, but yeah, different people learn differently. So presenting in a visual format or an audio format, or just ability to read, and using those things together. So in training, there's the notion of do, show, tell, or wait, show, tell, do. Is that right? Tell, show, do. Anyway, show them. You're
the training expert.
Training expert needs coffee. So showing somebody what it is you're trying to do, and then telling them how to do it, and then letting them get their hands dirty and do it themselves. Nobody ever take a course from me, because I don't know what I'm talking about.
I think people should take courses from you, Carrie. It's still a good idea. You know, it's funny you mentioned that, because even this Shapers recap video, Nawaii, I know you were in that thread in Genesis Slack General around the first episode we did, and or the Shapers recap video, and there was somebody that was like, well, you transcribed it, but you only made it closed captioning. I actually want to read the whole transcription in one go. And then somebody else was like, well, could you do like recap bullets? And then someone else was like, well, could you do like a narrative recap? I'm like, okay, so we got like narrative recap, a video, transcriptions, and then I promised I would look to see if we could do it via an emoji interpretive dance, but that did not work out. So we'll have to see what happens when we publish this video. We definitely have the transcription for accessibility, but we'll see how many of those we can actually produce. But what about you, Nawaii? How do you think about the difference in learning styles and how you create documentation and educational material?
Everyone is different, so probably everyone is going to have different preferences. I prefer usually to have a step-by-step written tutorial, probably with screenshots if there is some settings hiding somewhere, because I think that I go faster than in a video. That there is people like Carrie. I can recommend Carrie's courses because I did, and she's great teaching. They do short videos, but some of them take like, I don't know, half an hour to maybe explain one thing that you could read in 5 minutes. So depending of your expertise level, it's going to be different, but I tend to prefer the written ones with the copy-paste code that is also easier to move around. But that's just my preference. And regarding the recap, I was the one asking for the MP3 version because
for the podcast. That's right. I forgot that one. Oh my goodness.
That one is not that difficult because you can extract the MP3 just because I consume a lot of podcasts and I can do it synchronously because having the video all the time is not easy if you are coding or something like that. But anyway,
I like it. Okay, I have to remember the MP3 for this one, Nawaii. Maybe we'll do this episode MP3 at least just for you.
I'm going to write some documentation on how to strip the audio from the video, so you can just do it yourself, Nawaii.
Oh yes, I can do a video.
Yeah. Nice one, Carrie. Yeah, I understand. I can do it myself. I was just thinking of other people because I attend to the meeting, so I usually know what is talking about. But yeah, nice one.
All right. Well, we'll look into that. Maybe revisit the emoji interpretive dance idea. But I wanted to thank you both for joining us today. I really enjoyed the discussion and certainly your contributions at the Shapers meeting. So thanks, Nawaii.
My pleasure.
Awesome. And thank you, Carrie.
Sure thing.
If you'd like to learn more about what Carrie is up to, you can visit carriedils.com. Has a lot of great training material there around Genesis. And of course, Nawaii at codigogenesis.com, CODIGO Genesis.com. Tons of great training material there as well, focused around the Spanish Genesis community. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today for the Genesis Shapers recap video for the Genesis Community Livecast. Again, I'm your host, David Vogelpohl. I've been a proud member of the Genesis community for over 8 years. I lead Genesis at WP Engine, and I love helping the Genesis community get better together with my friends from the Shapers. Thank you all.